In the summer of 1974, at a farm equipment and land improvement auction outside of Grundy Center, Iowa, a 31-year-old woman named Nora Reinhardt paid $60 for a used Caterpillar D4 bulldozer that hadn't moved under its own power in at least 4 years. The tracks were seized. The blade was bent on the left side where it had caught something hard and never been straightened. The engine had been run dry of oil at some point, which the auctioneer mentioned the way a man mentions a dead relative at a dinner party, briefly and with the clear hope that nobody would ask follow-up questions. There were birds nesting in the exhaust stack. The hydraulic lines were cracked along the top where the sun had worked on them for years, and the seat cushion had been eaten down to the frame by something that had spent at least one winter in the cab. The auctioneer listed it as a project for the right buyer, which is what auctioneers say when they mean they're sorry it's on the list. A scrap dealer from Marshalltown bid $40 and stopped there. He'd done the arithmetic on what the steel was worth and decided the $40 was already generous. Nora Reinhardt bid $50. The scrap dealer looked at her. She bid $55. She bid $60. He shook his head and stepped back, and the gavel came down, and Nora Reinhardt became the owner of $60 worth of problem that no reasonable person in Grundy County, Iowa could explain. Her brother-in-law, Dale Reinhardt, was standing 6 feet away when it happened. He was a good man and he meant well, and he said exactly the wrong thing. He said, "Nora, what in the world are you going to do with this?" It wasn't really a question. It was the sound a man makes when he's trying to figure out whether to be concerned or amused, and he hadn't decided yet. She said she'd figure something out. By the time she drove home that afternoon, Dale had told the story at the co-op. By the next morning, it had reached the feed store in town. By Sunday, it had made the rounds of the church parking lot on the east side of Grundy Center, where it had gained some embellishment along the way. The bulldozer had grown larger, the price had grown smaller, and the birds in the exhaust stack had multiplied from one nest to what several people just listed act as a substantial colony. The story traveled the way all stories travel in small farming counties, from the feed store to the co-op, from the co-op to the diner, from the diner to the church parking lot, picking up detail and losing accuracy with every mile. Nobody in Grundy County understood why Nora Reinhardt had bought a broken bulldozer. They said so freely and often, and with the comfortable certainty of people who have never been wrong about anything that mattered. They were wrong about this. Let me tell you about Nora Reinhardt. Because what she did with that bulldozer, and what she did with the land it moved, only makes sense if you understand who she was and where she came from, and what her father taught her before the county had any opinion about her at all. Nora was born in 1943 on 160 acres of Grundy County ground that her grandfather had broken from prairie in 1901, and her father, Harold Reinhardt, had farmed without a mortgage since 1938. Harold was a quiet man with large hands and a habit of observation that his neighbors sometimes mistook for slowness. He wasn't slow, he was watching. He watched the way water moved across his fields after a hard rain. He watched where it pooled and where it ran and where it disappeared into the ground and where it didn't. He kept a notebook, a green ledger he bought at the hardware store in town, and in it he wrote the date and the rainfall amount and where he'd seen standing water and for how many days. He'd been keeping that notebook since 1934 when the drought showed him what the land looked like when the water was gone, and he decided he never wanted to be surprised by that again. Harold Reinhardt was not a machinist or a diesel mechanic in the formal sense, but he was a man who fixed everything himself because he believed that a tool you couldn't repair was a tool that owned you rather than the other way around. The shop behind the farmhouse had a concrete floor. He poured himself in 1947, a wood stove that burned the scrap lumber from every project he'd ever finished, and a workbench along the north wall that he'd built from oak, salvaged from a barn. The tools on that bench had been acquired over 30 years of careful selection, a chain hoist he'd bought, used from a railroad salvage sale in 1949, a set of wrenches he'd ordered from a catalog in 1953 and kept oiled and hung in order of size, a cutting torch he'd learned to use from a neighbor who'd worked pipeline before the war. He taught Nora to use all of it, not because he thought she'd need it, he told her once, but because a person who knows how something works is never entirely at the mercy of a person who charges to fix it. Harold had a philosophy about water that he'd arrived at the hard way, through the drought years of the 1930s and the wet years of the 1950s and the variable years in between. He believed that water on a farm was like money in a family. The years you had too much of it, you needed to be putting it somewhere safe, because the years it didn't come, you'd be very glad you had. He didn't say this poetically. He said it the way he said everything, plainly and once. And then he went back to watching. Nora watched with him. She learned to read a contour line the way other girls her age learned to read music, not as a technical exercise, but as a language that told you something true about the ground beneath your feet. She learned that water running off a field was not just lost moisture, but lost topsoil, lost fertility, lost future. She learned that a low spot in a field wasn't a problem to be tiled away and forgotten, but a place where the land was trying to tell you something if you were willing to listen. She was accepted to Iowa State in 1961. She had a suitcase packed and a bus ticket bought and a genuine intention to go. Her mother had a stroke in August of that year, and Nora unpacked the suitcase and put the bus ticket in the green ledger. She told herself it was temporary. It wasn't temporary. Her mother recovered partially, but never fully, and Harold needed help with the farm, and Nora was the one who stayed because she was the one who was there. Her two brothers had already left, one to Des Moines, one to a job with the county road department in a different county entirely, and they sent money when they could and came home at Christmas and were grateful in the way people are grateful when someone else is doing the hard thing so they don't have to. By 1968, Nora was running the farm. Harold was still present, still watching, still keeping his green ledger, but the decisions were hers. By 1971, when Harold died of a heart attack in the shop on the Tuesday morning in March, she inherited 160 acres of paid-for ground, a shop full of tools, a savings account with $11,000, and a green ledger with 37 years of rainfall and water operations recorded in her father's Carry Space shins. She also inherited his way of looking at the land now, the bulldozer. When Nora Reinhardt looked at that seized-up, bird-nested hydraulic crack D4 sitting in the auction yard outside of Grundy Center, she didn't see what everyone else saw. Let me tell you what everyone else saw. They saw $60 worth of scrap iron that would cost $400 in parts and labor to make run again, assuming it could be made to run at all. And then what would you do with it? You'd have a bulldozer. You couldn't plant corn with a bulldozer. You couldn't harvest beans with a bulldozer. A bulldozer was a contractor's tool, not a farmer's tool, and if you needed dozer work done, you hired it done and paid the man and sent him home. That was the sensible approach. That was the approach every reasonable person in Grundy County endorsed without having to discuss it. Here's what Nora knew that Grundy County didn't. She had been planning this for 14 months before the auction. In the spring of 1973, she had walked every acre of her farm, with her father's green ledger open in her hands, cross-referencing his 37 years of water observations against what she was seeing with her own eyes. She had identified 9 low spots on her property, where water pooled after heavy rain and stood for days before it either evaporated or soaked in. She had identified 3 natural drainage corridors, where runoff moved fast across the surface and carried topsoil with it. She had identified the 2 places on her property where a properly constructed pond, not a drainage pond, not a tile outlet, but a real impoundment sized and shaped correctly. She had done the arithmetic on what it would cost to hire a dozer contractor to build those ponds. The going rate in Grundy County in 1973 was $18 an hour for machine and operator, and the work she had in mind would take a minimum of 40 hours, probably 60. That was between $720 and $10 and $80, assuming the contractor didn't find complications, and contractors always found concations. One said $800, one said $950. Neither price included her having any say in exactly where the blade went, or how the berms were shaped, or what the spillway looked like. She wanted to build these ponds herself to the specifications her father's notebook suggested and her own observation confirmed. At a time of her choosing without paying a man by the hour to do work she was capable of supervising better than he was. That's why nobody understood the purchase. They were seeing impulse. They were actually watching execution that had been underway for over a year before the gavel came down. Let me tell you about the rebuild, because this is where Nora Reinhardt proved that knowing how something works is worth more than knowing what it costs. She had the D4 hauled to her farm on a borrowed flatbed. She put it in the shop, which was large enough for the machine with room to work on 3 sides, and she spent the first 2 evenings just looking at it, not touching it, not starting the diagnosis, just looking. Her father had taught her that the first thing you do with a broken machine is understand what it's telling you before you start changing things, because a machine that's been broken for 4 years, and it deserves the courtesy of being listened to. The engine had been run dry of oil. She pulled the head and found scoring on 2 cylinders, not catastrophic, but real, the kind that would cause blow-by in oil consumption and eventually failure if ignored. The crankshaft journals were within tolerance. The block was sound. She needed rings, a head gasket, and a valve job, and she needed to hone the 2 scored cylinders, which she could do with a hone she borrowed from the co-op shop for the price of asking. The hydraulic lines she replaced entirely. She measured and cut new hose at the farm supply in town, $42 for the hose and fittings. The hydraulic pump was intact and functional once she flushed the old fluid and replaced the seals, which cost $11 from the Caterpillar dealer in Waterloo, who seemed mildly surprised that she knew exactly what she needed and didn't require any assistance figuring it out. The tracks she freed with penetrating oil applied over 3 days and a length of pipe on a breaker bar, working each link individually in the evenings after the field work was done. The track tension was off on the right side. She adjusted it. The blade she straightened cold with the chain hoist and a length of heavy pipe as a lever, working in 2-in increments over the course of an afternoon, checking the alignment with a string line after each adjustment until the cutting edge was true within a 1/4 inch across its full width. Engine parts from the Caterpillar dealer, $68. Head gasket and valve grinding, $22. Hydraulic hose and fittings, $40. Hydraulic seals, $11. New filters, fuel and oil. Track adjustment hardware, $8. Grease, penetrating oil, and shop supplies, $16. Seat cushion replacement, cut and sewn from a piece of vinyl coal she bought at the fabric store in town. Total, $185 plus the $60 at auction, $245 for a running Caterpillar D4. The contractor's estimate had been $800 minimum just for the labor to build the ponds. Nora Reinhardt had bought and rebuilt the machine that would build them for less than 1/3 of that, and she still had the machine when the work was done. She started the D4 on a Saturday morning in October of 1974, 6 weeks after the auction. The engine turned over 4 times and caught and settled into an idle that was rough for the first 2 minutes and then smoothed out as the oil pressure came up and the temperature climbed. She let it warm for 20 minutes watching the gauges, listening to the exhaust note, feeling the vibration through the seat. Then she engaged the tracks and drove it out of the shop and across the yard and into the first field she intended to work. Dale Reinhardt was there that morning because he'd heard the engine start from his place a 1/4 mile up the road and driven over to see what was happening. He stood at the field edge and watched her make the first pass with the blade, cutting the berm line for the first pond site, and he didn't say anything for a long time. And he walked over to where she'd stopped to check her grade stakes, and he looked at the machine, and he looked at the cut she'd made, and he took his cap off and rubbed the back of his neck. He said, "How much did all this run you?" She told him. He put his cap back on. He said, "Nora, I'll be damned." She said, "I know it." She built the first pond that fall, working evenings and weekends after the harvest was done. Both were constructed to the specifications she'd worked out from her father's water observations, positioned to capture runoff from the maximum number of uphill acres, with spillways designed to pass a 100-year rainfall event without eroding the berm, with side slopes gentle enough to be stable and to allow livestock stacks XX if she ever needed it. She seeded the berms to bromograss in the spring of 1975, and by summer they were established and holding the ponds filled with the spring rains of 1975 and stayed full through the summer. Nora watched the water level through July and August, checking it against the gauge rod she'd set in each pond, recording the levels in a new notebook she'd started for the purpose. She was not celebrating. She wanted to know exactly how much water these ponds held and how fast they lost it to evaporation and seepage, because she needed that information to plan the next 2. She built 2 more ponds in 1976. By 1978, she had 5 impoundments on her 160 acres, holding a combined surface area of just over 4 acres of water. Fed by the natural drainage patterns her father had mapped over 37 years of watching, the county thought this was eccentric at best. The general opinion, expressed freely at the feed store and the co-op and the diner on the south side of Grundy Center, was that Nora Reinhardt was putting a lot of work and a lot of her farm ground into something that didn't produce anything. Ponds didn't grow corn. Ponds didn't grow beans. Every acre of water was an acre that wasn't in production. And in a county where the price of farmland was being measured by its production potential, to intentionally tanking acres out of row crops to hold water that you could get from a well seemed like the kind of decision nobody asked her for an explanation. This was partly because she was a woman farming alone in a county where that was still unusual enough to carry a certain social awkwardness, and partly because the people who had laughed at the bulldozer purchase didn't particularly want to invite a conversation. She didn't offer one. Let me tell you what happened over the next 10 years, because this story stops being about a bulldozer and ponds and starts being about something else entirely. Between 1974 and 1984, Nora Reinhardt farmed her 160 acres without a loan. She bought a used 2-row planter in 1975 for $300. She bought a used combine in 1977 for $4 $200 cash from a retiring farmer in the next county, and replaced the worn concaves and cylinder bars over the winter before she needed it. She kept the green ledger, her father's original and her own continuation of it, and she kept the second ledger for the farm's finances, recording every income and every expense in the same careful hand her father had used for rainfall. Her expenses were low because her equipment was paid for, and she maintained it herself. Her income was variable because corn and soybean prices were variable. But her costs didn't rise with her income the way her neighbors' costs did, because her neighbors were financing their equipment and their operating expenses and sometimes their land on borrowed money. And borrowed money has a way of expanding to fill whatever income is available, and then a little more. By 1981, Nora had $44,000 in a savings account at the Grundy Center bank. Not because she was getting rich from farming. The margins were thin, and she knew it, but because she had been spending less than she made for 7 consecutive years, and the difference had accumulated the way water accumulates in a well-built pond. If you have ever watched a community underestimate someone for years, while the evidence accumulated that they were wrong, stick with me. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story I'm telling. You know what happened in the summer of 1988. The drought came in late May and didn't break. June was dry. July was the driest on record for most of the upper Midwest. The corn was burning in the field by the 3rd week of July, rolling its leaves in the heat, shutting down photosynthesis to conserve moisture, doing what corn does when the water stops, which is stop growing and start dying. The USDA would later estimate that the 1988 drought reduced corn production in Iowa by nearly 40%. In some counties. It was worse than that. In Grundy County, farmers who had been counting on a normal yield to service their operating loans found themselves looking at half a crop against full debt payments, and the arithmetic didn't work. Grundy County sits on a glacial aquifer that is generally reliable but not inexhaustible, and in a drought year when every farm in the county is drawing on it simultaneously, shallow wells went dry first. By mid-July, there were farms in the county where the livestock water had failed, where the irrigation systems that had been installed in the late 1970s and early One Valley were pulling air, where the operators were hauling water in tanks from town until the drought broke. Nora Reinhardt's expenses didn't change. They couldn't change. There was nothing to cut. Her equipment was paid for. Her land was paid for. She had no operating loan because she had been financing her operations from the previous year's income since 1974. Her 5 ponds held water. Not as much as in a normal year, the levels were down 2 feet by August, but they held water, and her livestock had water, and her shallow-rooted cover crops on the berms and waterways were still alive because the ponds had allowed her to maintain soil moisture in the adjacent ground through the spring. She watched what happened to her neighbors with quiet sadness, not satisfaction. These were not bad farmers. They were not foolish people. They had built their operations the way the extension service and the equipment dealers and the farm lenders had told them to build, financed over 5 years and operating lines of credit renewed annually. And land purchased at the prices the 1,900 Septimus Chemis Buma had established. They had done everything right by the standards their county had agreed upon, and the drought and the debt together were taking them apart. The Hoffmeister place, 2 miles east, went to the bank in August. 80 acres of good ground that Carl Hoffmeister's father had farmed since 1931 sold at a bank auction in September for $62 an acre because there were no buyers with cash and the bank needed the debt off its books. The Vandermolen operation, 120 acres on the north edge of the county, was listed for sale in October. The family had been in Grundy County since 1908. Nora went to the Hoffmeister auction. She sat in the back of the crowd and watched Carl Hoffmeister stand at the edge of his own property while the bank's auctioneer sold it, and she felt the weight of what she was watching, which was not just one man's loss, but the consequence of a way of farming that had been celebrated in this counting what it cost. She bid on the ground. She bid against 2 land speculators from outside the county and a farm management company out of Des Moines. She bid in increments of $5 an acre, calm and steady, the same way she bid on the bulldozer 14 years earlier, until the speculators stopped and the farm management company stopped and the gavel came down at $71 an acre for 80 acres of Grundy County ground. $71 an acre, 80 acres, $5,680. She wrote a check. The crowd went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the auction being over. It was a rearranging everything. They thought they knew quiet, the kind of quiet that falls over a group of people when something they've been assuming for a long time turns out not to be true. They had watched Nora Reinhardt for 14 years. They had watched her buy a broken bulldozer and dig ponds nobody asked for and farm without new equipment and decline every invitation to finance her way to a larger operation. They had interpreted all of it as limitation, as the behavior of a woman who couldn't access credit or couldn't think big or couldn't understand how modern farming was supposed to work. What they were actually watching was a woman who had been building a position for 14 years that no drought and no bank could touch. Dale Reinhardt was standing near the back of the crowd. He found her afterward near the parking area, and he stood for a moment without saying anything, which was not like Dale, who generally had something to say about everything. He said, "Your father would have understood exactly what you just did." She said, "I know it. He taught me." That was the whole conversation. Let me tell you what happened after that, because the land purchase was not the end of the story. It was the proof that the story had been true all along. Nora farmed 240 acres through the late 1980s, the original 160 plus the 80 she'd bought at the Hoffmeister auction. She built 2 more ponds on the acquired ground in the fall of 1988, using the D4 that was now 14 years old and still running on the engine. She kept the green ledger. She kept the financial ledger. She kept watching the water. In 1991, she bought another 40 acres at a private sale from the Vandermolen family, who had decided to sell rather than wait for another bad year. She didn't negotiate hard because she knew the family, and she knew what the ground was worth, and she thought the difference between a fair price and the lowest price she could get wasn't worth the relationship. By 1994, she was farming 280 acres of paid-for ground with paid-for equipment, and 5 ponds on the original place, and 2 on the Hoffmeister ground, and her savings account at the Grundy Center Bank had grown to something that would have surprised every person Pankot wore, though she had no particular interest in surprising them. Her niece, Carol, her brother's youngest daughter, started spending summers on the farm in 1990 when Carol was 13. She was a quiet girl with large hands and a habit of watching things which Nora recognized immediately as a family trait. She taught Carol to run D4 in the summer of 1991. She taught her to read a contour line and to understand why water moved the way it did and what you could do to change its direction without fighting it. She taught her to keep a ledger and to understand that the ledger was not a bookkeeping exercise, but a conversation with the truth about your operation. In the summer of 1993, Carol was 16 and could run the bulldozer as well as Nora could and read a topographic map better than most adults in the county. She was in her father's shop, Nora's shop. Harold's shop one evening in July, learning to use the cutting torch on a piece of scrap steel when she asked Nora why she built the ponds in the first place back in 1974 when nobody thought it made sense. Nora thought about it for a moment. She said, "Your great-grandfather kept a notebook for 37 years watching where the water went. When he died, he left me the notebook and the land and the tools to do something about what the notebook said." The ponds were just the answer to a question he'd been asking since 1934. Carol said, "What was the question?" Nora said, "Where does the water go when it doesn't rain?" In 1995, the Grundy County Soil and Water Conservation District asked Nora to speak at their annual meeting. She was 52 years old and had been farming in the county for 30 years and had built 7 stock ponds on 280 acres of ground and had survived the 1988 drought without losing an acre of land. They wanted her to talk about water management. She stood up in front of about 60 farmers and said what she had to say in about 4 minutes, which was approximately 3 minutes and 50 seconds longer than anyone had expected, from a woman who had spent 20 years not explaining her. She said her father had taught her that the years you have too much water are the years you build the places to put it. Because the years it doesn't come, you'll be very glad you did. She said she'd spent $60 on a bulldozer in 1974 and $245 total to make it run, and that machine had built 7 ponds that held water through the driest summer in 50 years. She said she understood that ponds didn't produce corn and that every acre of water was an acre out of production, and she said she'd done the arithmetic on that trade-off in 1973, and she'd come out comfortable with the answer. Then she said the thing that the room remembered afterward, the thing that got repeated at the feed store and the co-op and the diner, the same way the bulldozer story had been repeated 20 years earlier. Except this time without the laughter, she said. "I've been hearing my whole life that the sensible approach is to hire what you need and finance what you can't hire. I tried to figure out who that approach was sensible for, and the best I could tell it was sensible for the people doing the hiring and the people doing the financing. It wasn't especially sensible for the person doing the farming." Dale Reinhardt was in the back row. He laughed first, and then the room laughed, and then it got quiet again in a different way, a thinking way. The way a room gets quiet when someone has said something plainly true that the room has been circling around for years without landing on it. Let me ask you something. What do you see when you look at a broken bulldozer sitting in an auction yard with birds in the exhaust stack and a bent blade and a seized track and a cracked hydraulic line and an engine that's been run dry of oil? Most people see $60 worth of problem they don't need. Nora Reinhardt saw 7 ponds. She saw the answer to a question her father had been asking since 1934. She saw $245 standing between her farm and the drought that was coming 14 years later. The drought that emptied the wells and took the Hoffmeister place and the Vandermoen ground and a dozen other farms in Grundy County that had been in families since before anyone living could remember. She saw what her father had taught her to see, which was not what the thing was, but what the thing could become in the hands of someone who understood what the land needed and was willing to do the work to give it that. $245. AC's Caterpillar D4, a green ledger with 37 years of rainfall in a dead man's handwriting, 7 ponds that held water through the summer of 1988 while everything around them went dry. A machine nobody wanted built by the woman. Nobody understood until the drought came and the wells went down and the silence in that auction crowd said everything the county had never been willing to say out loud.